So, Professor Mark Dooley is another member of the tree, the I guess the club of three, so to speak, as in people who have appeared on this show three times. He is a philosopher and an author, and today we are discussing the great French thinker Jacques Derrida, of whom uh, Professor Dooley has written a book on titled "The Philosophy of Derrida." How are you today, Mark? Thank you for joining the show.
Great to be here again, Sean.
Okay, so let us begin by a quote from the American political scientist Mark Lilla on Derrida.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone who has heard him lecture in French knows that he is more performance artist than logician. His flamboyant style, using free association, rhymes and near rhymes, puns and maddening digressions, is not just a vain pose, though it is surely that. It reflects what he calls a self-conscious, a-communicative strategy for combating logocentrism. Do you think that Professor Lilla is getting to the point there?
Well, there's no amount of bad coverage of Derrida over 50 years. Actually, he's dead 20 years next year. He died in 2004, and even in death, he arouses this type of reaction. And it is, I don't exonerate him entirely from that. I mean, in the book that I co-wrote with one of my former students, who's now a professor of philosophy in Villanova in the United States, I make the point that Derrida was as much to blame for the misunderstandings of his work as those who very, ungraciously misinterpreted him. And that was because he assumed that everybody had read Hegel, had read Husserl, had read Heidegger, had read Kafka, had read all the avant-garde writers, and he spoke in that idiom, and it's a very complex idiom, as anyone who's tried to study contemporary continental philosophy will appreciate. But Derrida took it to extremes, and he did play with puns, and not alone that, there were puns on these thinkers' turns of phrase or whatever, again, which the complexities of which are renowned. So if you weren't in the know, if you didn't understand these thinkers, you wouldn't have got the puns. And in fact, it would have been double Dutch. Roger Scruton once called it a kind of a theological language that only the initiated were permitted to understand or to enter or to engage in. He was, of course, being critical of Derrida. There is a bit of that, but I think there was no kind of malicious intent on Derrida's part in so doing. It was just that he was a kind of a performer, I suppose. He was an avant-garde writer. He was trying to push the limits of language, but he did so in an idiom that excluded most people, actually.
Mm-hmm. Right. So before we get into Derrida's thoughts, why don't you tell us the difference between the analytic school of philosophy and the continental school? I understand that I think within the turn of the 20th century, these two movements began to form.
Well, I mean, they both have a common heritage, really. I mean, they both derive from Descartes and Kant and the fledgling idealist movement that was then there, and but one stuck very clearly talking of the analytic school now, which is primarily British based, and stuck very clearly to an idiom that was comprehensible. That's the first thing. It was a language that, like you and I are now speaking. The great thinkers of that tradition include Ludwig Wittgenstein, Anscombe, Moore, Russell, Frege, all of these people, and they were more interested in traditional questions of philosophy about the nature of mind, reality, and so on, and the correspondence theory of truth, whether the mind could reflect or did correspond to or did represent things in the world, and to what degree it did. Okay. It also emerged out of the empiricist movement, which, of course, as you well know, was initiated by David Hume, and so there was these age-old problems of philosophy that were being discussed now in a very logical style within the British Academy. That was, and at the same time, on the continent, you had people like Husserl, Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, who were also coming out of that Kantian Cartesian school, but were more informed, let's say, by Hegel and the language of Hegel and the issues of Hegel. And of course, as we've discussed before on your fine podcast, on our discussion, during our discussion on Hegel, the language again is a problem to begin with. Once you get into it, of course, and you school yourself in it, it becomes less complex, less arduous, but it is difficult. And their questions were more about our relationship to each other, our relationship to the world, but as being situated in the world. So it's very much personalized now. It's not dealing with abstract questions of how the mind relates to the world, but our situation in the world. And the complexities for the human being of being in the world, as Heidegger put it. And of course, it moves into existentialism then, and the great questions of Jean-Paul Sartre, and his great declaration, man is what he makes of himself, and so on. What you find also in the continental movement is that there's a political strain in most of the great thinkers that run downstream from Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, whether that be in it kind of goes off into sub-branches: critical theory, deconstruction, structuralism, all of these which have to do with related questions to the analytic school, but which go in an entirely different direction. And of course, existentialism being that which borrows from Kierkegaard and Heidegger, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and then down into Heidegger and so on. Mm-hmm. So it's very different. And yet they have common roots, and the questions are very different. So, when you have a continental philosopher walking into a discussion on analytic philosophy, it's as though they see the world in entirely different terms, and as though they are speaking entirely different languages. And that's wherein the problem for Derrida lay. I mean, most of his critics were from the analytic school or were influenced by it, although he had plenty of critics within the continental school too. But they saw the world very differently to the way he did.
Mm-hmm. Right. So in the book, The Philosophy of Derrida, you made a conservative case for him. So to quote, Derrida desires to subject our values and institutions to a radical critique. But what distinguishes him from so many of his contemporaries is that he only deconstructs and critiques that which he loves. He is not interested in simply accusing the Western tradition of all manner of abuse and oppression. He wants to preserve our intellectual traditions, but argues that we can only do so by opening them up, especially when they prove resistant to the risk of the future and what is to come. So would Derrida himself regard himself as a conservative person?
Well, he did say that. I mean, I borrow his phraseology. There's a wonderful book by the American philosopher come theologian John D. Caputo, C-A-P-U-T-O, who's a great Derridian. And he did a book based on a conference that was held in Villanova in 1997 in Philadelphia, during which Derrida said, "I am a very conservative person." Okay. Now, much to the horror of many of those assembled, but what he meant by that was, and I think he was less tongue-in-cheek than serious, as a matter of fact, that Derrida was not into deconstruction. Does not equal destruction, for starters. Neither is it like the project forged by Michel Foucault, for example, that sees power structures dominating all forms of life and all spheres of existence. And we must intellectually fight against these power structures by doing genealogies on them and histories on them in order and to debunk them, to live a life that is totally free of these, what Kenneth Minogue once called the worm of domination. It's not like that at all. Derrida simply saw that traditions and histories and texts, books, the major texts that stand at the heart of those traditions and those contexts, have a history. And sometimes the history is skewed in a particular direction, or sometimes it kind of becomes encrusted. It's not rigorous. It doesn't self-reflect. And so what he does is he pushes against the grain of those received truths that flow downstream from the arche, from the beginning of tradition, and he subjects them to critical analysis. He looks for what the dominant histories and the dominant traditions don't write about. Some purposely exclude, some exclude on it by accident. They've simply forgotten about what's excluded. And it's his great project to recover those to the best of his ability. And thus it's our responsibility as well. But of course, some of these resist. Some of these narratives, some of these stories, some of these ideas resist being recollected, in the words of Hegel. They resist being memorized simply because they've been totally effaced and lost. And at the heart of every tradition, you meet that point where you can go no further, right? The historical record just will not allow you to move beyond a certain point. The archive will not allow you to move beyond a certain point. And it's that point, pressing against that, seeing how far that can be pushed, that gives rise to new thinking, novelty, reworking the traditions and so forth, not disposing of the traditions, just reworking them, seeing them anew, seeing them afresh, and not settling down into, just merely accepting what has been handed down from one's forebears. And I think that's something all conservatives should do, actually. I think you cannot receive something and simply accept it without any critical analysis, or refuse to probe it or engage with it in a critical spirit. We must do that. We must do that.
Mm-hmm. So I think in one of our dialogues, you mentioned that Roger Scruton has engaged in both the analytic and the continental traditions of Western philosophy. And I believe in his work, Thinkers of the New Left, he was pretty harsh on Derrida. So what would Sir Roger say about Derrida's philosophy?
Well, actually, the one thinker that he did mention him in passing in both the Thinkers of the New Left and the reworked version from 2016, Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands, but he never gave a chapter to him as such. He did write about him comprehensively in his book Modern Culture under the very provocative title The Devil's Work. And he used to think of him as the arch charlatan who wrote nonsense, who wrote about nothing. That was his aim, to bring us to this state of nihilistic nothingness, which was totally wrong in my estimation. And after many conversations and reading my book, Moral Matters, in which Derrida features alongside Scruton, alongside Burke, alongside Plato and so on, many thinkers having a conversation in that book, Roger confessed to me that I had changed his mind about Derrida somewhat, which was a great achievement, actually, given what he had written about him in the past. And I think what he saw was that there was this kind of missing link. If you take, again, it goes back to what we were discussing at the beginning. If you take Derrida at face value, it's very easy to write him off as some kind of esoteric charlatan, whose language is so impenetrable, it's not worth bothering about. But if you get down to the basics and see that this man was an heir of Hegel, as was Roger Scruton, and that his primary motivation was to think about memory, what Hegel again called recollection, and realize that memory, through which all things are transmitted to us, we heirs of the past, is somewhat flawed, that there are gaps and holes in memory. And it's what Derrida called the catastrophe of memory. That there's only, again, reverting back to what I was saying about tradition a moment ago, there's only so much that we can recollect without glossing over the holes and making them seem as though there's a coherent narrative, when in fact the narrative is porous, is full of missing links, as it were, what Derrida called traces or secrets or ash. He liked to use the metaphor of ash, where you have ash, and ash reveals that something was there, all right, but it has no form. It can't be put into a picture. It can't be resurrected, as it were. And so, therefore, when you see him as a person who is dealing with memory, a philosopher of memory, who admits that memory is flawed and that there must be room for mourning that we cannot remember, mourning the things that we can, you see that whereas Roger Scruton tells us what we ought to remember as conservatives, as people who are interested in conserving the past, Derrida tells us that we ought to remember, but that there are things that we cannot. And when we face that fact, we're in the critical spirit of deconstruction.
So you mentioned that Soren Kierkegaard, the great Dane, had a considerable influence on Derrida. And I would like to quote the book again. Kierkegaard went to extreme lengths to rescue writing from the systematic procedure of what he called bookbinding, the attempt to force a single dogmatic interpretation on a text. So you mentioned that the ancient thinkers of Socrates and Plato hated writing because I think they would assume that writing damages the process of remembering and memory in some sense. Would Derrida, agree with them?
Yes, he would. I mean, again, there is a flaw there, which I don't necessarily bring out in my earlier work, The Politics of Exodus, which was on Kierkegaard and dealt a lot with his relationship to Derrida. And they both attack Hegel, although they're both totally engaged with the Hegelian enterprise, and they can't extricate themselves from it. But they both attack him for building this grand system of this great encyclopedic system in a book form, that the whole history of consciousness is mapped out for you in a book. And of course, what they want to show is that there are blind spots to consciousness, blind spots to recollection, as we've been discussing, and that book formation, book writing, is a process that, as Kierkegaard liked to put it, it contains fragments that fall to the floor. You're always editing and cutting things out and snipping and cutting away and so forth. So he's more interested now, Kierkegaard, in these philosophical fragments, which is the title of one of his works, and he's more interested in what ends up on the floor or in the editor's bin than he is in the official book that appears, because those are the lost pieces, the missing pieces. Derrida likewise, he's more interested in what interestingly, there was a Derrida reader brought out at one of the many readers that were brought out at one stage, and it was quite voluminous, but on the front cover it was called Between the Blinds, or Between the Lines, I think. And on the front cover, you had Derrida, and then you had this kind of blind effect, like blinds, where he was partially in view. Because there are things about him, and he always made this point, that no psychoanalyst, no interpreter will ever penetrate to, about his personal life, about his own life, that he can't understand. I mean, he doesn't know every element of the family tree stretching right back to Algeria, right back as far as his ancestry goes. So he is an enigma to himself, just as we're all enigmas to ourselves. And that thing that cannot be recouped, that thing that resists being recouped or recollected, is what he calls singularity. And Kierkegaard had a kind of a notion that was quite similar. He talked about the single individual or the singular other. And it is similar. It is the first expression of this within philosophy, where you encounter another human being, and that other human being has secrets, has a dimension that cannot be, consumed by our consciousness, by our philosophical thinking, by our psychoanalytic thinking, and so forth and so on. Well, now you can see already here that Derrida would have a critique of Freud, for example, and his notion of the talking cure. For one, talking also, and this goes back to what you said about Plato, that speech also, it's direct, it's a direct expression, but once it leaves the mouth, it goes to the hearer, and it ends up becoming part and parcel of a whole network of consciousness that tears it apart, says, you go and you report what I said, he said this, and of course it becomes distorted when you pass it on. And so it's what Derrida called in one of his works dissemination. It's disseminated out, but you can't control the direction that it goes. So even with speech, things are lost, things are misinterpreted, and the singularity is again free from this circumscribing control that philosophy traditionally, according to Derrida and according to Kierkegaard, tried to exert on writing. Now, that's all the philosophy of language in the continental tradition. Kierkegaard was more interested in theological matters. And so the singularity, your singularity, is a revelation for him of the holy other. What the holy other, WHOLLY, meaning God, meaning this part of you that is what Kierkegaard called inwardness, he called it, that belongs to God and therefore is inaccessible to others. And this is why he had this great notion of the single individual standing before God, just like Abraham does on Mount Moriah as he's about to plunge the knife into Isaac. He stands before God alone in his inwardness. And God says, stay your hand, or the angel says, stay your hand, you have proved yourself worthy. So Derrida tries to build himself into that great theological tradition that Kierkegaard inaugurated in a little work that he published shortly before his death, well, about 7 or 8 years before his death, called Don et la Mort, or The Gift of Death, as it's translated. And he does a fine job then of stitching up his relationship to Hegel and to Kierkegaard in that theological tradition. So, long way of answering your question, yes, Derrida would agree with that.
So, yeah, to mention Abraham of the Bible, of course, his story only begins when he is in his mid to late 70s, when God tells him to get out of his home and go to this promised land. So in the first 70 or so years of his life, we don't really know much of it. So I suppose Derrida feels the same way, given that he has an Algerian background and his family history is not particularly well recorded. So yeah, tell us more about his Algerian background and how that influences his thinking.
Well, it influences his thinking greatly, because remember that he was Jewish, and from a place called El Biar in Algeria, and he was one of the Pied Noirs, and therefore he has this very complex background, which permeates all of his writing. Jewish tropes and motifs run throughout it all. I mean, the Abraham features time and time and time again, as does the notion of circumcision, And this notion of being cut from the origin, cut from the very beginning, as we were discussing, as we have been discussing it throughout this conversation. So this notion of the cut or the wound, and the inability to stitch everything back together again. So he's bringing the Jewish motifs into play in all of his writings. Therefore, now you've got an added problem if you're coming to Derrida for the first time. You've got all of these philosophers that he presupposes that you've read and that he's working in, and all of these texts. I mean, he takes very off the beaten track parts of traditional texts and literary texts, and works his way into them there. So you have to have a knowledge then of the text that he's talking about in order to understand the little bit that he's discussing, or the little bit that proves complex. But now you have another problem. You have to have a theological understanding that undergirds his work. So the Jewish motif of being cut from the origin, being separated from this reconciliation which the Christian tradition embraces through the redemption of Christ, and then the complex identity that he had, coming from Algeria, coming in as an emigre into France, and building himself into the French culture while not totally French, you see. So there's always loss. There's always this notion of loss. Again, what cannot be recovered, and coming, as an exile into an emigre, into a situation where there's a dominant narrative, and he can only share that narrative up to a point. He can only share the French narrative up to a point. Now, this is well brought out in a kind of Kierkegaardian text that he co-wrote with Geoffrey Bennington, one of the great Derridian commentators, called Circumfession, playing on both circumcision and confession. Okay, the traditional Christian rite of confession, of course, there, but also the work of Saint Augustine, the Confessions. So the book is written with a fairly standard biography written by Bennington on the top half of the page, and down at the end, in kind of where you would normally place footnotes, is Derrida's script, Circumfession. And what he's trying to do is, or what he's trying to demonstrate, is that no matter how Bennington, how much Bennington knows about Derrida, and he knew an awful lot about Derrida, no matter what he tells you on top, there are all these little secrets coming up from the bottom, undermining, cutting away at Bennington's grand narrative on top. And they are very theological, they are very autobiographical, and they discuss this notion of circumcision, they discuss this notion of bloodlines, bloodletting, cut from the main bloodline, cut from the bloodline of God and so forth, cut from his own bloodline, is his name, Jackie. They used to call him Jackie in Algeria. All of these little things that, haunt. This is another word he used quite a lot, haunting, that haunt Bennington's main text up above, and that disrupt it from within. Again, just as we're discussing in terms of identity, that identity does not go all the way down. There's no such thing as a pure identity. And Derrida is living proof of that, with all this admixture of Algerian, Jewish, emigre, all of that coming up to disrupt the main biography of this great so-called French philosopher. So it is going back to the citation that you made at the beginning, it is a drama. It is very dramatic, but it's a drama with a purpose, and it's more a dramatization showing you, demonstrating to you what the point he is trying to make, rather than lecturing you or taking you by the hand and schooling you systematically, logically, and rationally in these things. Now, of course, one would prefer at times a little bit of clarity. You don't often get it in Derrida, but when you cotton on to what he's up to, and you understand that he's working within the Hegelian tradition of memory and recollection, it all kind of just falls into place. And an awful lot of it then, just an awful lot of the language problem simply, I won't say disappears, but is workable.
So Derrida focuses much of his criticism of the Western intellectual tradition on what he deems to be his logocentrism. So yeah, why don't you explain that? What is logocentrism means and what his problems of that are?
Yes, he had two expressions. Well, he had a number of expressions that play on that. And here we get into his neologisms, as he called it, and here's another problem. Now, it seems that there's problems mounting up for the potential reader, and there are, which is why you go and you read secondary sources first, I suggest, without plunging straight into Derrida's own text. So you've got logocentrism, you've got phonocentrism, you've got phallogocentrism. Now, these are all a bit tricksy and a bit unnecessary, but he's trying to make a point, and the point is this, that the Western tradition of philosophy and thinking is dominated by reason. Okay, it's done, so logocentrum, from the logos, and the word, okay, the word, and that thus you get phonocentrism from phonetics, and then you get phallogocentrism, meaning that again, he's playing on sexual motifs here, that it's dominated by the man. It's male, it's dominated by the voice, and it's dominated by reason. Now, we've discussed already how he tries to deconstruct the voice and showing you that once something is spoken, it automatically escapes from the speaker. The speaker has no more control over it now because it's gone to you. People listening to this podcast, for example, will take my words. They'll say, but he meant to say, or he said, or he didn't say, or he misinterpreted Derrida there, or that didn't make sense, or that was rubbish, or whatever the case might be. And then you've got these, what Paul Ricoeur, the great, well, really was a conservative French philosopher in the continental tradition, called this conflict of interpretations, which, of course, Ricoeur believed could be resolved by looking at all of the interpretations and then seeing the common thread to them. But Derrida believed they couldn't be resolved, that interpretation goes off in this kind of dissemination, and there's no shape, meaning, rhyme, or reason to it. It cannot be controlled or contained. It can be set down in writing, which is what Plato tried to do. Socrates never wrote, but Plato was his amanuensis, so he took down in writing what. But of course, he already knew the threat. He already knew the problem, which is why he didn't like writing. And Derrida plays a lot on this in his text, The Postcard. In the front, there's a little depiction, which is from Balliol, Oxford, I think, held there, of Socrates and Plato, and one is speaking over the other and whispering in his ear, and he's writing it down. But of course, the point is that once it goes onto the text, then the whole sphere of interpretation opens up, and the purity of the voice, the purity of the intention of the author is lost. And you can see here how Derrida is saying now, the Western tradition has maintained this Platonic notion that the voice has a purity, is central to everything, and that writing is second class, that it's defective, that it's deficient, that it tears away the intention, and so on and so forth, which it does. And Derrida is saying that's a good thing. That's just a fact of life. Plato is pouring scorn on it and lamenting it. And what Derrida is trying to do is to get us away from this phonocentrism and to embrace writing, and to see that there is an opportunity in writing, in seeing the potential to open up new interpretations of texts, new horizons of meaning that the author never intended. Doesn't mean that they're wrong. I mean, think about many, for example, Shakespeare. The multitude of interpretations of Shakespeare, a Shakespearean tragedy, for example. Now, unless they totally bypass the text and totally lose the Geist, or the spirit of the text, as Hegel would call it, the authorial consciousness, they're going to be, you can lock them into that text at some level. So they're not totally off. So long as they don't detach entirely in one's interpretative matrix from the original, you're on safe ground. So Derrida is seeing opportunities with this, and he's saying, no, the notion of reason, the notion of the voice, the notion of the phallus in traditional, in the dominant narrative of the West, needs to be rethought. And it needs to be rethought on the basis of, again, these motifs that open up when you subject it to critical analysis, what he called deconstruction. Again, not destruction, but merely looking at the constructions, both philosophical, theological, political, aesthetic, that we have built and maintained, and seeing are there little gaps and interstices that we can move into and think anew.
Mm-hmm. I suppose a good example of what Derrida is talking about is that, well, we all have a Bible in our living rooms and bedrooms. And whenever we go to a fancy hotel, a copy of the Bible is waiting for us. And it's been translated into multiple languages as well. And the reason that we all have a personal copy of the Bible is a product of both the invention of the printing press and the Protestant Reformation. So the result is that there are just as many interpretations of the Bible as there are readers of the Bible, and therefore multiple churches sprang up that defies the authority of the one church, what we call the Catholic Church. I wonder if so I guess what I'm trying to say is that the process of deconstruction, rather than a new thing that Derrida invented, like many would assume, it started long ago with Martin Luther and the Reformation. But how would Derrida answer to the charge that, well, with all these multitude of interpretations of this of a given text, how would you prevent the rise of relativism?
Well, again, he's not promoting a multitude of interpretations. He's just saying that is what happens. That's just the way it is. And that is the way it is. There's nothing, I mean, you listen, for example, within Protestantism, you've got now, 37,000 denominations? All told, churches springing up on every street corner with who's on the basis of the rejection of the church that's on the other street corner, and as you say, that's very much in contrast to the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, or the Eastern Orthodox Church for that matter. The traditional churches, which have a dominant reading. Now, what Derrida is saying is that, we have a series of texts that open themselves to interpretation. And even little bits of them. What did Christ mean when he said, before you were called, I saw you sitting under the fig tree? Nathaniel says, oh, truly you are the Son of God. What does that mean? Right? We can argue back and forth about that for a week, actually. So you truly are the Son of God. Oh, you think that's you believe on that basis? Well, you'll see, angels, coming to and from heaven and so forth and so on, Christ goes on to say. And so already we're opening up here images of maybe Lucifer falling from heaven or whatever it might be, or on the day of the ascension, angels coming down and going up with Christ and so on. So there's all of this. Now, are we to say, and I'm speaking as Derrida here now, that must come to a stop because a particular branch of theology says that must come to a stop? Or are we to say that there is, amongst all of these multitude of interpretations, a correct insofar as it can be correct interpretation, based on tradition. And based on tradition, you can work your way back to the original councils prior to the Protestant Reformation and see that in their reading of the text, that there was a fairly standard interpretation, even though they came from the four corners of the known world, these people, the church fathers, as we call them. But even there we notice that there's problems, and even then we notice that in the case of the Orthodox Church, that the Great Schism, that the part of the creed which says talks about the Holy Spirit as proceeding from the Father and the Son is the bone of contention. Okay, so we have a grand split in the church on those issues, on the issues of the creed, and again on interpretation within the dominant church of the time. So I think all Derrida's pointing out, pretty tame to say, but it is quite controversial when you put it in context of a political or a theological framework, that you cannot stop the process of interpretation. Okay, you cannot stop the process of dissemination. Even now within the Catholic Church, the liturgical wars that are raging are based on that interpretation of the ancient texts and how we should worship God, and how you genuflect before the altar, whether you ought to genuflect before the altar, whether you should face the people or turn your back to the people, whether we should all pray to the east or not pray to the east, whether it's a communal meal or is it this moment of glory where the heavens open and man and God become one through the great sacrifice and the offering of communion and reconciliation. So all of this, even within the dominant churches, is raging. I think again we need to go back to Paul Ricoeur's great expression that these conflict of there is always going to be a conflict of interpretations, but that does not mean that they cannot be reconciled through imagination and dialogue, and through never losing sight of the text itself, right? As long as it's anchored in the text. And we can see quite clearly that many of the kind of marginal, peripheral readings of the Bible, for example, in many of these denominations, have lost sight of the text, unfortunately.
Right. So Derrida, wrongly or not, was placed under the category of postmodernists, and I think from my understanding, postmodernism is anchored by a rejection of grand narratives. And I suppose when you compare Derrida to another, I guess, postmodernist, Michel Foucault, you'll see that Derrida he keeps a skeptical approach to grand narratives, but he does not propose a rejection of grand narratives, whereas Foucault is going out of his way to reject them. So tell us more about where's Derrida's attitude towards grand narratives, and in particular the Western grand narrative.
Well, again, it goes back to the question of the book that we discussed earlier, and the fact. I mean, Derrida made this comment about Hegel in his book of Grammatology, that we will never be done with the reading and the rereading of Hegel. So, in other words, there is no rejection here of Hegel at all. In fact, there's a love of Hegel. But there is also a spirit of, well, I won't say, kind of a semi-critical spirit that looks at the text and sees, again, where Hegel glosses over or tries to stitch up various aspects of the narrative that don't comfortably fit together. And into that space, Derrida moves. Now, for example, Hegel has a very complex theory of memory, that forms part of his encyclopedia. And Derrida moves into that little space, only a few paragraphs, and tries to show that the theory of memory, or the actual complexity of memory that Hegel tries to explain, is insufficient, thus undermining the Hegelian theory of memory to a degree. But it's never again to debunk or to destroy Hegel. It's merely to shine a light on those elements of Hegel that Hegel himself took for granted, but didn't probe necessarily and sufficiently. And so too with all the grand narratives, whether they be theological, whether they be political. The stories, the narratives that we tell about ourselves, our origins and so forth and so on, all reveal, again, these blind spots. And Derrida is merely trying to point out that what he called, he once said, I have a taste for the secret. That the secret are these things that remain hidden from us in the stories that we tell. And I've referred to this many times today. And he has a taste for that. He wants to go into that point, if he can, where the secret, where there are secrets, and to show, not to show that he can retrieve the secret or to shine a light on the secret and make it known, to appropriate it by reason, or to have reason appropriate it. No, but to show that once we press against these things, we do reach, sometimes we do reach, blanks. There's no way we can move beyond that. This is the great notion of the trace that he said, we have indications, we have traces, but the trace doesn't reveal itself, otherwise it's not a trace, it's a reality. And so the grand narratives remain in place for Derrida, but he's always probing at them, showing that they have that there's assumptions that we make about them that are not borne out by the evidence, are not borne out by critical memory, and that it's into that space that we must go if we are to be true to ourselves. And so being true to yourself, by the way, doesn't mean that you have figured out your own grand narrative. Okay, it just means that you would confess that the story that you tell about yourself is of its nature a story, and therefore will contain elements that will be even foreign to you.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I guess the issue with grand narratives, and especially political ones, is that they can lead to totalitarianism. And it is not so surprising that two of the most notorious ones in the 20th century, Nazism and communism, take their cues from Hegel in some way, shape, or form. And I suppose Derrida believes that there needs to be a room for like the personal narrative that deviates somewhat from the grand narrative. Otherwise, there'd be no real political or even human freedom. Would that be a correct assessment?
Yes. Remember that, going back to the notion of singularity, we always build our narratives, grand or otherwise, by suppressing singularity, this irrecoverable moment. I won't say a thing, because that gives it a kind of a substance. You can't, according to Derrida, it's you can't appropriate it, you can't recover it, you can't resurrect it. So to point that out is to show that our constructions are often built on sand, as distinct from on rock, to use the metaphor of Christ. And that when the totalitarian proclaims the narrative, the grand narrative, such as Hitler did in terms of the Aryan race, or as the communists did in terms of the manifesto, or the communist worldview, or the scientific theory of the dialectic leading inevitably to communism. When you declare that, well, then you are suppressing singularity. You're suppressing the exception. You're suppressing what cannot be taught. You're suppressing what cannot be memorized, and so forth, and recollected. And so it has to be built on exclusion. And what Derrida wants to do is open that up again and show you that any such declarations are indeed false. And even doing so it's a kind of a gentle sort of a thing, really. I mean, it's not going to stop the totalitarian from proclaiming the grand narrative. It's not going to stop us from declaring stories about ourselves which are patently untrue and which end up in all sorts of jingoistic and religious mania. So it's not going to stop that, but it can kind of sound a critical note. It can caution us that to do so is to scapegoat people, it's to scapegoat singularity, it's to suppress and repress. And all of those things are, by their very nature, bad for Derrida, and will inevitably lead. And remember, he's speaking as a kind of a marginal character. His whole life he is on the margins. Which is why my very first published article in a refereed article way back 30 odd years ago was Kierkegaard on the margins of philosophy, and I was trying to show again this comparison between Kierkegaard and Derrida as thinkers who press us to the margins and show us that that when we assume these totalitarian postures, we always exclude those on the margins. That for him is just patently unethical.
So, final question. Derrida is very much a contemporary thinker, although he passed away in 2004. But what are some of the issues facing us today, whether political or social, that Derrida can be helpful at coming up with a way out?
Well, again, I speak very much as someone who reinterpreted him, because there's an awful lot of my conservative friends and colleagues who reject him outright, but once they listen, you can see things kind of changing totally, even if they don't accept him fully. And there's most of Derrida's left-wing friends and allies would reject my interpretation entirely, because they don't want him associated with any conservative thinking at all. But I would merely claim to say that through his notion of memory and the catastrophe of memory, his notion of mourning and forgetfulness, and yet his joy at the prospect of new visions opening in terms of new interpretations, not again ex nihilo, not from nowhere, just when we push against the grain of the narrative and see the blind spots, and then new thinking, we think anew. To do that is a conservative critical endeavor, as I said at the beginning, and it also helps us to see through, for example, looking at America. 2 examples: America and Ireland. In terms of the stories that certain sections of the American population tells about itself, this can be very useful. It can be useful in terms of the fact that, for one, let's say this attempt to rewrite history, revisionism, where we reject the founding fathers' vision, we reject the great traditions of America. Now, Derrida would reject that type of left-wing mania as much as he would reject the overly conservative approach to cementing the dominant story that we tell about ourselves. And he would say, blah, blah, you miss the point on both sides of the equation. You don't look at the great texts of your tradition, those of you who are tearing down statues and rejecting your ancestry. And yet those of you who claim that there aren't certain injustices within the system, you too are blind to the the catastrophe of memory. In my own country, in Ireland, for example, there is a kind of a nationalistic element, always has been here, which is as distinct from a patriotic element. And so again, once again, here we have a grand narrative of these great, martyrs for, a pure Ireland, of, an Ireland where we ourselves are alone in our identity. That's the translation of Sinn Féin, for example, ourselves alone. So to read that against the grain is a very important thing, because again, it undermines this kind of jingoistic, nationalistic element. We should always be on the lookout in any of our traditions for points of resistance where, things do not sit easily with our narratives or our stories that we tell about ourselves, that we like to spin in order to give our particular group a good airing in front of the public. That is an important thing to do for political reasons, but also for personal reasons. It shows a kind of a humility, that our identities are not secure, all the way down, and that we exclude others at great cost to ourselves, because somewhere along the line, along the bloodline, those others may very well have belonged to us.
Well, on that wonderful note, thank you very much, Dr. Mark Dooley, for joining the show once again.
A great pleasure, Sean. Thank you very much.
Always a great pleasure. Take care of yourself.
Bye-bye.